Iron Vale Keep stood as a monument to fear and protection in equal measure. The fortified settlement was an imposing structure of gray stone and iron gates, built 3 generations ago when the conflict between humans and werewolves threatened to consume the northern territories. Though the days of open warfare had faded into uneasy memory, replaced by a fragile peace built on mutual distrust and carefully guarded borders, the keep remained heavily garrisoned. Its soldiers stood watch day and night, their eyes fixed on the dark forests beyond the walls, ever vigilant against the threat they had been taught since childhood lurked in the shadows. In the highest reaches of this fortress, where the north tower pierced the sky like a stone finger pointing toward the heavens, there existed a place that sunlight touched only briefly at dawn. The Forbidden Tower was a relic from darker times, its upper chamber specifically constructed to contain creatures of supernatural power. The walls were inscribed with binding runes that had been carved by long-dead mages, and the chains that hung from the ceiling were no ordinary metal. They had been forged with enchantments that pulsed with an eerie blue fire, magic designed to suppress transformation, to drain strength, to keep a being trapped between 2 forms. It was here, in this place abandoned by compassion and forgotten by justice, that a wolf had been held prisoner for 8 agonizing months. The wolf was a breathtaking sight, even in his diminished and tormented state. His fur was a silver white that caught what little light filtered through the narrow tower windows, though now it was matted with dried blood and grime from months of confinement. His eyes were the color of molten amber, burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the darkness with an inner luminescence. He was massive, easily the size of a warhorse, and even restrained and weakened by the enchanted chains that seared his flesh wherever they touched. There was something about his bearing that commanded an instinctive awe. The guards who were ordered to make the long climb up the spiral staircase to check on the prisoner always did so with barely concealed dread, never approaching closer than the doorway. They would peer in, confirm he still breathed, and retreat as quickly as protocol allowed. No one in Iron Vale Keep knew his true identity. To them he was simply another werewolf, captured during a failed raid on a merchant caravan near the border. The official story claimed he had killed 2 guards before being subdued by a hunting party using silver nets and binding spells. He was destined to remain chained in the tower's highest chamber until he finally succumbed to infection, starvation, or the slow poisoning of the enchanted bonds that never allowed his wounds to fully heal. The High Council occasionally debated his fate in their closed chambers. Some advocated for a public execution, a spectacle to remind the werewolf kingdoms that Iron Vale Keep would not tolerate aggression. Others argued he was more valuable as a hostage, a living warning kept locked away where no one need think about him. And so he languished, forgotten by nearly everyone except the one person tasked with keeping him barely alive. That person was Rose Sylvester, a young woman of 26 who served as an apprentice to the keep's physicians and herbalists. Rose was an orphan, her parents having perished in a plague that swept through the lower districts when she was only 7 years old. She had been taken in by her grandmother, a renowned herbalist who had served the keep for 4 decades. Under her grandmother's patient tutelage, Rose had learned the art of healing, the properties of every herb that grew in the region, how to set bones and stitch wounds, how to read the body's signs of sickness and health. It was demanding work that often went unappreciated, and the position paid modestly at best, but Rose was grateful for the purpose it gave her life and the roof over her head in the healer's quarters. 4 months ago, the head physician had assigned Rose to the most undesirable duty in the entire medical staff, tending to the werewolf prisoner in the North Tower. It was a task everyone avoided if possible, not only because the tower was isolated and the climb exhausting, but because most of the healers feared the chained creature despite knowing intellectually that he could not reach them. But Rose had accepted the assignment without protest, as she accepted all her responsibilities, with quiet dignity and a determination to do her duty well. The first time Rose climbed those winding stone stairs, carrying a basket with basic supplies, bandages that were nearly threadbare, a jar of weak antiseptic salve and stale bread with water, her heart hammered so violently in her chest she thought she might collapse before reaching the top. The tales she had absorbed throughout her childhood had painted werewolves as savage beasts, monsters without conscience or mercy who killed for the pleasure of it. But when she pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the tower chamber, when she finally saw the creature bound within, the emotion that crashed over her was not the fear she had anticipated. It was heartbreak. The wolf lay on the cold stone floor, his breathing labored and shallow. The enchanted chains binding his powerful limbs and neck glowed with that unnatural blue flame, and where the metal pressed against his flesh, Rose could see burns that wept clear fluid, wounds that should have healed but couldn't, held open by the suppressive magic. He was clearly malnourished, his ribs visible through his once magnificent coat, and his eyes, though still bright and alert, carried the weight of suffering that had gone on far too long. Rose approached the center of the chamber slowly, her soft leather boots making barely a whisper on the stone. She set her basket down at what she judged to be a safe distance, close enough that he could reach the offerings but far enough that he couldn't lunge at her even if the chains suddenly failed. The wolf raised his great head to look at her, and for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met. Rose had expected to see rage, perhaps madness born of isolation and pain. She had steeled herself for hatred, for the feral emptiness she'd been told lived behind a predator's gaze. But what she saw in those amber depths was intelligence, profound and unmistakable, and something that looked almost like curiosity, or perhaps surprise that she had actually entered rather than leaving his meager rations at the door. She retreated carefully, backing toward the door without turning away from him, her healer's instincts screaming at her that something was profoundly wrong with this situation. She pulled the door closed behind her and descended the spiral stairs as quickly as she dared, her mind reeling. But the image of those golden eyes haunted her throughout the rest of that day and into the night. She lay in her narrow bed in the healer's quarters, unable to sleep, because there had been something in that gaze that seemed achingly human. And that realization troubled her in ways she couldn't articulate even to herself. In the days that followed, Rose made her daily climb to the North Tower, always bringing the minimal supplies she was allotted for the prisoner. Old bandages, the cheapest salve, food that was barely adequate. And each day she found herself lingering a little longer, observing the wolf from what she told herself was a professional distance. She began to notice patterns, small details that no one else would have seen because no one else bothered to truly look. She noticed how he always waited until she had left and closed the door before touching the food, as though he possessed too much dignity to show vulnerability in front of a witness. She noticed how he tracked her movements with those intelligent eyes, his gaze following her around the chamber as she checked the rune inscriptions on the walls or adjusted the ventilation grates, but he never growled or snapped or tried to intimidate her. She noticed the way his breathing changed when she spoke softly while working, as though her voice brought him some small comfort in the endless silence of his confinement. It was in the third week that Rose did something that could have resulted in severe punishment if the High Council discovered it. The rations provided for the werewolf prisoner were deliberately minimal: bread too stale to be served in the soldiers' mess hall, water from the rain barrels rather than the fresh well. The medical supplies were limited to whatever was too old or worn to be used on human patients. It was care designed to keep something alive, but only just barely. And Rose, watching as the wolf deteriorated noticeably from one day to the next, his magnificent frame becoming more skeletal, his wounds growing more infected, felt her conscience rebel. So she began bringing more. A proper cut of meat from her own meal rations, wrapped in cloth and hidden at the bottom of her basket. Herbs from her grandmother's private garden that she knew had powerful healing properties. Comfort for wounds, feverfew for infection, valerian root to ease pain. Fresh water from the healer's private cistern in a small flask she concealed in her cloak. Bandages that were clean and soft rather than the rough, contaminated rags she had been given. She told herself it was simply her duty as a healer, that she couldn't stand by and watch any living being suffer needlessly when she had the knowledge and means to help. But deep down, in a place she was afraid to examine too closely, Rose knew it was more than professional obligation. There was something about this creature, this prisoner who watched her with ancient, knowing eyes, that called to something in her own isolated soul. Before we dive deeper into Rose and Newton's journey, I need you to do something for me. If this story has already captured your imagination, if you're curious to see how a healer breaks unbreakable chains and frees a king, then howl with the pack. Hit that like button to show your support, subscribe so you never miss another tale of magic, love, and impossible choices, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. Are you joining us from the frozen north, the moonlit forests, or somewhere completely unexpected? Your engagement helps this story reach others who need to hear it, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when those chains finally shatter. Now let's return to Ironvale Keep, where Rose is about to receive the assignment that will change everything. Rose was scrubbing dried blood from a mortar when Master Aldrich found her in the herb preparation room. The head physician was a stern man with silver hair and a perpetually disapproving expression, but there was something different in his face that morning, something that looked almost like reluctance. "Sylvester," he said, and Rose set down her cleaning rag immediately. "A word." She followed him into the corridor where morning light filtered weakly through narrow windows. He didn't meet her eyes when he spoke. "The prisoner in the North Tower requires medical attention. The council has decreed he must be kept alive for the time being." Aldrich's mouth tightened as though the words themselves tasted bitter. "You'll take supplies up twice daily. Morning and evening. Do not linger. Do not engage with it beyond what is absolutely necessary for basic treatment." Rose's stomach dropped. Everyone in the healer's quarters knew about the North Tower, about what was kept there. The other apprentices whispered about it in the dormitories. A monster, a killer, a creature that would tear you apart given half a chance. "I understand, Master Aldrich," she heard herself say. He handed her a ring of iron keys and a worn leather satchel. "The supplies are meager. Use them sparingly. And Rose..." He finally looked at her and she saw something unexpected in his weathered face. "Pity. Be careful." The climb to the North Tower seemed endless. Rose's legs burned by the time she reached the uppermost chamber, and her hands trembled as she fitted the largest key into the ancient lock. The door groaned open on rusted hinges and the smell hit her first: blood, infection, and something wild and alive beneath it all. Then she saw him. The wolf was enormous, sprawled across the stone floor in a shaft of pale sunlight that only made his suffering more visible. Chains wrapped around his body, glowing with that terrible blue fire she had heard about but never seen. Where the metal touched his silver-white fur, the flesh beneath was raw and weeping. His breathing was labored, rattling in his massive chest. Rose took one step forward, then another. Her healer's mind catalogued the damage: infection, malnutrition, chronic pain, possible internal injuries. This wasn't treatment. This was torture dressed up as containment. The wolf's head lifted, and those amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that froze her in place. A low growl rumbled from deep in his throat, a warning that needed no translation. But Rose saw past the threat to the agony behind it. She saw a living being who had been abandoned to suffer alone in the dark. And something inside her, something her grandmother had planted there with every lesson about mercy and the healer's oath, refused to look away. She knelt slowly, setting her satchel on the stones between them, and began unpacking bandages and water with hands that no longer shook. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing if he could understand her, only knowing she needed to say it. "I'm so sorry this was done to you." The growling stopped. In the silence that followed, Rose felt something shift in the tower chamber, something profound and irreversible, like the moment before lightning strikes. The wolf's eyes held hers, and for just an instant she could have sworn she saw not an animal staring back at her, but a man drowning in an ocean of pain, reaching for the first hand that had been offered in 8 months of darkness. And in that moment, though she didn't know it yet, Rose Sylvester sealed both their fates. The first week passed in careful increments of trust. Rose came twice daily, always at the same hours, her footsteps on the spiral stairs becoming a rhythm the wolf learned to recognize. She noticed how his breathing would change when he heard her approach, how his great head would lift toward the door before she even turned the key. On the third day when she entered, he no longer growled. The wounds were worse than she'd initially assessed. The enchanted chains had created deep burns that festered despite her careful cleaning. She worked methodically, soaking the damaged flesh with solutions of golden seal and calendula, applying poultices that her grandmother had taught her to make. The wolf endured her ministrations in silence, though she could see the tremors that ran through his body when the pain grew too intense. "I know it hurts," Rose murmured as she worked, her voice soft in the empty tower. "But infection will kill you faster than the chains. Just a little longer." She began talking to him during her visits, partly to calm herself, partly because the silence felt wrong somehow. She told him about her day, about the ridiculous argument between 2 physicians over the proper ratio of willow bark to feverfew. About the bread she'd burned that morning because she'd been thinking too hard about proper wound debridement techniques. On the 5th day something extraordinary happened. Rose was applying fresh bandages when her hand slipped, pressing too hard against a particularly raw section of his shoulder. She gasped an apology, expecting him to snap at her, but instead he went utterly still. When she looked up, those amber eyes were fixed on her face with an expression so clearly patient, so obviously understanding that her breath caught. "You do understand me," she whispered. "Don't you?" The wolf's ears swiveled toward her voice, and something in his gaze seemed to confirm what she'd suspected but hadn't dared believe. After that, everything changed. Rose began bringing better food, cuts of meat from her own rations, fresh bread she secreted away from the kitchens. She brought herbs not just for his wounds but for his strength. Ginseng root to restore vitality, hawthorn berries for his heart, chamomile for the stress she could see eating away at him. The wolf began to eat while she was present, no longer waiting until she left. It felt like acceptance, like an unspoken acknowledgement that she was not his enemy. By the second week he would lean slightly into her touch when she checked his wounds, making her work easier. His eyes followed her around the chamber with an awareness that went beyond mere animal instinct. When she laughed at something, a clumsy moment when she nearly tripped over her own basket, she would have sworn the expression in his face was amusement. The breakthrough came on a gray afternoon in the third week. Rose was kneeling beside him, carefully unwrapping the chains on his foreleg to treat the burns underneath, when she heard heavy boots on the stairs. The door burst open and one of the tower guards stumbled in, clearly drunk, his face flushed with ale and malice. "Well, well," he slurred, leering at Rose. "The little healer playing with her pet monster. Maybe you need a real man too." The wolf's snarl tore through the chamber like thunder. Rose had never heard anything like it, pure rage and warning and protection all woven into a sound that made the stone walls seem to vibrate. The guard went white, stumbling backward, his bravado evaporating instantly. He practically fell through the doorway in his haste to retreat, his curses echoing down the stairwell. Rose's heart hammered as silence returned. She turned slowly to find the wolf still tense, his lips pulled back from fangs that could easily tear a man apart, every muscle coiled and ready despite the chains. But his eyes weren't on the door anymore. They were on her, checking, assessing, making sure she was unharmed. "You protected me," Rose breathed, understanding flooding through her. "You're not a mindless beast at all, are you? You're someone. Someone who was taken, chained, forgotten." The wolf held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of those golden eyes, Rose saw something that made her soul ache with recognition. A desperate, silent plea from a person trapped in a form and circumstance beyond his control, begging to be seen, to be known, to be remembered as more than a monster. She reached out with a trembling hand and gently touched his massive head, her fingers sinking into blood-matted fur. "I see you," she whispered. "I don't know who you are, but I see you." That night, Rose Sylvester had her first dream of a silver-haired man with amber eyes, calling her name across an impossible distance. The dreams came every night after that first one, growing more vivid, more real, until Rose could no longer distinguish memory from vision. She walked through forests she had never seen, where ancient pines stretched toward a sky ablaze with stars. The air tasted of frost and freedom and something wild that made her heart race. She heard music. A haunting melody played on instruments she couldn't name, and somehow she knew it was his favorite, a song from childhood that spoke of home and belonging. And always, always there was the man. He had silver hair that fell past his shoulders like moonlight made solid, and those same amber eyes that watched her from the tower. In the dreams he was whole and unbroken, dressed in clothes that spoke of authority, deep blues and silvers embroidered with symbols she didn't recognize but somehow understood meant kingship. He would reach for her across impossible distances, his mouth forming her name though she couldn't hear his voice, his expression desperate with longing and warning both. Rose woke each morning with her pillow damp from tears she didn't remember crying, her mind full of knowledge that shouldn't exist. She knew the scent of pine smoke mixed with cedar that filled the great halls of his home. She knew the weight of a crown she had never touched, the taste of wild berries that grew only in the northern mountains, the sound of wolves singing to the full moon in voices that were more than animal. She knew betrayal, the acid-sharp memory of trusted advisors turning against him, of silver nets falling from darkness, of magic binding him in a form that should have been his to control. And she knew his name, though no one had spoken it aloud in her presence. Newton. On the fourth night of dreams, Rose startled awake just before dawn, her heart pounding. She had seen the tower through his eyes, had felt the agony of the chains burning into flesh, the slow poison of silver in the bloodstream, the crushing weight of isolation. But more than that, she had felt his awareness of her. His gratitude. His growing need for her presence that went beyond the healing she provided. When she climbed the tower stairs that morning, her hands shook as she unlocked the door. The wolf, Newton, was already watching her when she entered. She set down her basket slowly, then crossed the chamber and knelt before him without the usual hesitation. Up close, she could see flecks of gray in his silver fur, scars that told stories of battles fought long before his imprisonment. "I've been dreaming about you," Rose said quietly. "Or maybe you've been showing me things. I don't understand how it's possible, but I see you, not like this but as you truly are." She took a shaking breath. "Your name is Newton. You're not just a wolf. You're their king, aren't you? The alpha king of the Shadowpine werewolves." The wolf went utterly still. The intelligence in those amber eyes sharpened, intensified, and Rose felt something bloom in her chest, a warmth that spread through her veins like liquid sunlight, confirming what she'd suspected. There was a bond between them. Something mystical, impossible, growing stronger with each passing day. Something that allowed his consciousness to reach hers across the barrier of his cursed form. "How long have you been able to hear my thoughts?" Rose whispered. "How long have you been trying to reach me?" The answer came not in words but in a flood of emotion that nearly knocked her backward. Longing, relief, desperation, and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. She gasped, pressing a hand to her chest where the warmth had settled, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Show me," she breathed. "Show me what happened to you. Show me everything." That night the dreams changed. Instead of fragments and impressions, Rose experienced Newton's memories with perfect clarity. She stood in his skin during the peace summit, feeling his cautious optimism as he negotiated with human diplomats. She felt his shock when the trap was sprung, council members he had trusted revealing themselves as conspirators, silver nets enchanted to force his transformation and hold him there helpless. She heard their justification. He was too powerful, too much of a threat to the fragile peace. Better to cage him, to use him as a hostage, to prevent the war his very existence might provoke. She felt his rage turn to despair as months bled into months in the tower, hope dying a little more each day. Until she arrived. Rose woke with the dawn light streaming through her window, tears streaming down her face and knowledge burning in her heart. Newton Pius wasn't a prisoner of war. He was a political sacrifice, betrayed by both species and left to rot in chains while those who imprisoned him congratulated themselves on preserving peace. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach turn with horror, was that the High Council knew exactly who he was. They had always known. She dressed quickly, her mind racing. As she hurried through the morning preparations, Rose's thoughts spiraled with questions she'd been too afraid to ask. If they knew he was the Alpha King, why keep him? What were they waiting for? What did they plan to do with him? The answer came that afternoon when Master Aldrich called an assembly of all medical staff, his face grim. "The High Council has made their decision regarding the prisoner in the North Tower," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent room. "In 7 days' time there will be a public execution. The creature will be put down as an example to all who would threaten Ironvale Keep." The room erupted in murmurs, but Rose heard nothing over the roaring in her ears. 7 days. She had 7 days to save a king that no one knew needed saving, using a bond she barely understood and powers she didn't possess. When she reached the tower that evening, Newton was already watching the door, and in his eyes she saw that he knew. Somehow, through their connection, he had heard the sentence passed upon him. But there was no fear in his gaze, only a terrible, resigned acceptance that broke something inside her. "No," Rose said aloud, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't let them. I don't care what it costs. I won't let you die in chains." Through the bond she felt his response. A wave of protest, of warning, of desperate concern not for himself but for her. He was trying to tell her to stay away, to save herself, to let him go. But Rose had never been good at letting go, especially not of those who needed her most. And as she knelt beside him and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady beat beneath burned skin and matted fur, she made a silent vow that would change the fate of 2 kingdoms. She would free him or she would die trying. Rose spent the next 2 days piecing together fragments of truth like shards of a shattered mirror. The dreams came in waves now, no longer waiting for sleep. She would be grinding herbs in the preparation room and suddenly find herself standing in a grand hall carved from ancient wood, watching Newton address his council with quiet authority. She would be climbing the tower stairs and feel the phantom memory of silver nets tightening around limbs that were trying desperately to shift back to human form, the magic forcing him to remain trapped. Each vision brought new understanding and with it new horror. Newton Pius had come to Ironvale Keep of his own accord, she learned. He had accepted the invitation to the peace summit despite warnings from his advisors, despite the risks, because he believed in the possibility of ending centuries of bloodshed. He had stood in the council chamber, that same chamber where Rose had watched the execution order being passed, and offered concessions, treaties, assurances of his people's peaceful intentions. And they had answered with betrayal. The conspiracy had been carefully orchestrated. Lord Brennan, the Keep's High Counselor, had worked in secret with Victor Ashclaw, a rival alpha who coveted Newton's throne. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Capture the Alpha King, force him into wolf form using ancient magic, and keep him imprisoned as both hostage and symbol. The werewolf clans would be too fractured by internal power struggles to risk war. The humans would feel safe behind their walls. And Newton would suffer endlessly, trapped between forms, slowly dying while his kingdom fell to chaos. A sacrifice for peace, they called it. A necessary evil. Rose felt sick every time she walked past the council chambers now, knowing what had happened within those walls. On the third day after the execution announcement, she found something that confirmed her worst fears. She had been searching through old medical records, looking for any documentation about the prisoner's arrival, when she discovered a sealed letter tucked between pages of supply requisitions. The wax seal bore the High Council's mark, and the date was from 8 months ago, the day after Newton's capture. Her hands trembled as she read the careful script. The subject must be kept alive but contained. Under no circumstances is his true identity to be revealed. His continued existence serves as insurance against werewolf aggression, while his eventual disposal will demonstrate our strength. Maintain minimal care. Await further instruction. They had always known. Every guard who spat at his cell, every physician who refused to treat him properly, every day he spent suffering in chains, all of it had been deliberate. That evening, Rose climbed the tower with fury burning alongside grief in her chest. Newton watched her enter with those knowing amber eyes, and through their bond she felt his awareness of her emotional turmoil. She crossed to him immediately, kneeling so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his fever-racked body. "I know everything now," Rose said, her voice rough with suppressed anger. "I know who you are, truly are. Newton Pius, Alpha King of the Shadowpine Kingdom. I know about the Peace Summit, about Lord Brennan and Victor Ashclaw. I know this was never about justice or protection. It was political assassination disguised as imprisonment." Through their bond, she felt his surprise that she had learned so much, followed by a wave of resigned sadness. He had never expected anyone to discover the truth, much less care about it. "They're going to execute you in 4 days," Rose continued, her hands moving to check his wounds with practiced efficiency even as she spoke. "They're going to make a spectacle of it, parade you before the people as proof of their power. And your kingdom," her voice cracked. "Your people don't even know where you are, do they? They think you abandoned them or died or worse." She felt Newton's anguish pulse through their connection. Grief for his pack, for the chaos his absence must have caused, for the lives lost in the resulting power vacuum. Rose pulled back, meeting his eyes directly. "I can't let that happen. I won't. You came here in good faith, believing in peace, and they betrayed everything you stood for. That's not justice. That's murder." Through the bond, Newton's consciousness reached for hers, and this time she clearly understood what he was trying to communicate. Gratitude but also desperate warning. He was putting herself in danger. The council would show her no mercy if they discovered she knew the truth. She should run, should forget him, should save herself. "No," Rose said firmly, as if he had spoken aloud. "I'm a healer, Newton. I took an oath to preserve life, to ease suffering wherever I find it. But more than that," she pressed her hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat synchronize with hers through their mystical connection. "I see you. The real you. Not the monster they've made you out to be, but the king who sacrificed everything for peace. I won't abandon you to die alone." For a long moment they remained like that, Healer and wolf, human and werewolf, two souls bound by something neither of them fully understood but both felt to their core. Then Rose stood, her jaw set with determination that surprised even herself. "I'm going to find a way to break those chains," she said. "I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise you that." She left the tower with purpose burning in her heart, but she didn't see the shadow that detached itself from the stairwell as she passed. Didn't notice the guard who had been watching, listening, learning things that would make him very valuable to certain members of the High Council. By morning, Lord Brennan would know that Rose Sylvester had discovered their secret. And by evening she would discover that the execution had been moved up to tomorrow at dawn. Rose was summoned to the council chamber just after dawn broke gray and cold over Ironvale Keep. She had spent a sleepless night planning, researching anything she could find about enchanted chains and binding magic, but nothing prepared her for the sight of Lord Brennan's cold smile as she entered the grand hall. The High Council sat arrayed behind their curved table like judges at a trial, and Rose felt her stomach drop even before anyone spoke. "Miss Sylvester," Brennan began, his voice carrying the false warmth of a predator playing with prey. "We understand you've taken quite an interest in our prisoner." Rose's mouth went dry. "They knew. Somehow they knew. I was assigned to provide medical care," she said carefully. "I've only done my duty." "Your duty?" Counselor Meredith, a severe woman with iron-gray hair, leaned forward. "Your duty does not include spending hours in that tower, bringing unauthorized supplies, speaking to the creature as though it were human." "He is," Rose caught herself but too late. "He." Brennan's eyes gleamed with dangerous amusement. "How interesting. Most refer to it as the beast, or the prisoner. But you've given it personhood. Perhaps even discovered more than you should have." Rose's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't let them know how much she'd learned, couldn't give them reason to accelerate their plans further. "I meant no disrespect to the council. I simply—" "The execution has been moved forward," Brennan interrupted, and Rose felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Given certain concerns about security and the prisoner's deteriorating containment, we've decided to proceed at dawn tomorrow. The creature will be destroyed publicly as a demonstration of Ironvale Keep's strength." "Tomorrow." The word came out as barely a whisper. "But you said 7 days." "Plans change, Miss Sylvester." Brennan stood, and the other council members followed suit like a choreographed dance of condemnation. "You are hereby relieved of your duties regarding the prisoner. You will not return to the North Tower under any circumstances. Guards have been posted with explicit instructions to deny you entry." "You can't do this." Rose's voice cracked as desperation overwhelmed caution. "He came here in peace. He trusted you and you—" "Enough." Brennan's voice cut like a blade. "You will return to your regular duties and speak of this to no one. If you attempt to interfere with the council's decree, you will be charged with treason and conspiracy. Do I make myself clear?" Rose stared at him, seeing the calculation behind his eyes. He wanted her to defy them. Wanted an excuse to silence her permanently, to erase anyone who knew the truth of what had been done to Newton Pius. "Perfectly clear, my lord," she managed, though the words tasted like ash. She was dismissed with a wave of Brennan's hand, and Rose walked from the chamber on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The corridors of the keep seemed to close in around her as the reality sank in. Tomorrow. They would kill him tomorrow, and she was forbidden from even saying goodbye. But Rose had never been good at following orders that violated her conscience. That night she waited until the keep fell into the deep silence of the darkest hours. She'd stolen a guard's cloak from the laundry, pulled the hood low over her face, and made her way through passages she'd learned during years of midnight medical emergencies. The tower stairs loomed before her, and she saw the 2 guards posted at the base, just as Brennan had promised. Rose took a different route. There was a maintenance shaft that ran up the outer wall, used by workers to access the tower's exterior for repairs. It was narrow, treacherous, and hadn't been used in years, but Rose was small and desperate. She climbed in darkness, her fingers finding holds by memory and prayer, until she reached a ventilation grate that opened into the tower chamber. She squeezed through, dropping to the stone floor with a soft thud that echoed in the vast space. Newton's head jerked up from where he'd been lying, and even in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows, Rose saw the shock in his amber eyes. Then for the first time she heard his voice, Not aloud but crystal clear in her mind through their bond. Rose. Oh. Dangerous. I don't care, she said, crossing to him quickly. They moved the execution to tomorrow. I couldn't let them do this without. Her voice broke. I couldn't let you die thinking no one cared. She knelt beside him and Newton's presence in her mind intensified, flooding her with emotion, gratitude, despair and fierce protective instinct all tangled together. Then with what seemed like immense effort, words formed in her consciousness again. Leave me. Save yourself. Please. I can't, Rose whispered, pressing her forehead against his massive shoulder, feeling the heat of fever and the trembling of muscles pushed beyond their limits. I won't. There has to be a way to break these chains to free you. Enchanted. Unbreakable. Rose listened. No. She pulled back, meeting his eyes with determination that surprised them both. I'm a healer. I've spent my whole life learning how to mend what's broken, to find solutions when everyone else sees only hopelessness. These chains are magic, yes, but magic is just another form of energy. And energy can be transformed, redirected. You'll be killed. Treason. Rose, you must. I must save you, Rose said firmly. Because you're worth saving. Because what they did to you was evil and I won't stand by and let evil win. Because, she pressed her hand over his heart, feeling the bond between them pulse with life. Because somehow, impossibly, you've become the most important thing in my world and I will not watch you die. Through their connection she felt Newton's resistance crumbling, felt his desperate hope warring with his fear for her safety. Then finally she felt his acceptance, not of death, but of her determination to fight for him. Tomorrow dawn he sent to her and she felt the weight of finality in the words. If you have a plan it must be tonight. No. There is no more time. Rose straightened, her mind already racing through possibilities, calculating risks, assembling a plan from desperation and the scattered knowledge she'd gathered about magical bindings. It was insane. It would probably fail. She would likely die in the attempt. But looking into Newton's eyes, feeling his presence in her soul through a bond that defied every law of nature and society, Rose knew she had already made her choice. Then we break the chains tonight, she said. Together. And in the darkness of the tower, with dawn approaching like an executioner's blade, a healer and a king prepared to attempt the impossible. Rose spread her tools across the stone floor with trembling hands. Lockpicks stolen from the keep's forge, a vial of acid that might corrode metal, herbs that her grandmother's oldest texts claimed could disrupt magical bindings. It wasn't much. It probably wasn't enough. But it was all she had. The locks first, she murmured, moving to examine the mechanism where the chains connected to the iron rings embedded in the floor. Newton watched her work in tense silence, his presence in her mind a constant hum of anxiety and reluctant hope. The lockpicks slid into the first mechanism, and Rose worked by feel the way she'd practiced on the storage room locks in the healer's quarters. She felt the pins beginning to give, heard the promising click of tumblers shifting. The lock sparked, blue fire racing across the metal. Rose jerked back with a cry as the energy burned her fingers, leaving red welts across her skin. Enchanted, Newton's voice resonated in her mind, heavy with despair. Rose, I told you. They cannot be picked or broken by ordinary means. Then by extraordinary means, Rose said stubbornly, wrapping her burned hand in a strip of cloth. She pulled out the vial of acid, uncorking it carefully. This is derived from cave Wurm bile. It can eat through almost anything. She poured a careful stream across one of the chain links. For a moment nothing happened. Then the blue fire of the enchantment flared brighter, and the acid evaporated into harmless steam without leaving a mark. Rose tried the herbs next, wolfsbane and silverwort, bound with rowan bark and blessed thistle, exactly as the ancient text had described. She pressed the mixture against the chains where they circled Newton's foreleg, whispering the words of unbinding she'd memorized. The chains pulsed once, violently, and Newton's entire body convulsed with pain. Through their bond, Rose felt what he felt, the enchantment tightening, feeding on his life force, using his own energy to reinforce itself. Stop, she gasped, pulling the herbs away. It's making it worse. They feed on me, Newton sent his mental voice weak. The chains. They draw power from my life, my alpha essence. As long as I live they cannot be broken from the outside. That is why. No. Rose cut him off before he could finish that thought. There has to be another way. If they feed on your life force, then maybe. Her eyes widened as understanding crashed over her. Maybe they need a different source. Rose, what are you? But she was already moving, pressing her hands directly against the glowing chains where they wrapped around his neck. The metal was searingly hot, the enchantment hungry and alive. Rose felt it immediately, a pulling sensation like something with teeth latching onto her soul and beginning to draw. It was agony. The chains weren't just feeding on physical energy, they were consuming life force itself, draining vitality, warmth, breath, heartbeat. Rose felt her strength bleeding out through her palms, felt her vision beginning to darken at the edges. But she held on, gritting her teeth against the pain, because she could feel something else happening too. The bond between her and Newton, that mystical connection they'd been building for weeks, suddenly blazed to life like a torch touched to oil. Her energy flowed into the chains, but instead of simply being consumed, it traveled through the enchanted metal to Newton himself, feeding him, strengthening him, giving him what the chains had stolen. Rose, stop. You'll kill yourself. Not if you fight, she gasped, her words coming out in ragged bursts. Newton, please. Take what I'm giving you. Use it. Use our bond. Break these chains. She felt his resistance, his desperate desire to protect her even at the cost of his own life. But Rose pushed harder, opening herself completely to the flow of energy, letting it pour from her core through their connection. And finally, she felt Newton stop resisting. His alpha power, dormant for so long, sluggish from months of suppression and starvation, suddenly roared to life. Rose felt it through their bond, ancient strength rising like a tidal wave, the primal force of a werewolf king whose authority had been forged over decades of ruling, fighting, surviving. The chains had been feeding on that power for 8 months, but now it was fed, restored, amplified by the unprecedented connection between two souls that should never have bonded. The blue fire of the enchantment flickered. Rose, let go now. I can finish this. You've given me enough. No, she said through gritted teeth, her whole body shaking. Together. We do this together. She felt Newton's power surge again, felt him pulling on reserves she didn't know existed. His body began to shift beneath the chains, not transforming but swelling with muscle, with primal energy, with the full force of what he truly was. The chains, designed to suppress and contain, suddenly found themselves restraining something that refused to be restrained. Metal groaned. The blue fire sputtered, flickered, fought desperately to maintain its hold. Rose pushed more of herself into the bond, giving everything she had, dimly aware that she was collapsing but unable to stop. Newton's roar filled the tower chamber. Not just sound but pressure, authority, command. The howl of an alpha king who had been caged but never broken, who had found an ally in the most unexpected place, who would not die in chains while someone he cared for risked everything to save him. The first chain cracked. It was a sound like lightning splitting stone, sharp and impossibly loud. The link at Newton's neck shattered, blue fire exploding outward in a wave of released magic. Rose was thrown backward, hitting the floor hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Through swimming vision, she saw Newton surge upward, saw the remaining chains strain and groan under the force of his awakened power. Another crack. Another explosion of magical energy. The chains around his forelegs burst apart, metal fragments skittering across stone. Newton rose to his full height for the first time in 8 months, magnificent and terrible. Silver fur blazing in the moonlight streaming through the tower windows. The final chains, wrapped around his torso and hind legs, held for one more moment. Then Newton threw back his head and howled, and the sound carried such raw power that the very stones of the tower seemed to tremble. The bond between him and Rose flared one final time, their energies merging completely, and the remaining enchantments shattered like glass. The chains fell away in pieces of smoking metal and dying blue fire. For a heartbeat there was absolute silence. Then Newton's body began to convulse, bones cracking and reshaping, fur receding and skin emerging. Rose watched from where she lay on the floor, too weak to move, as the massive wolf twisted and changed, as magic that had been suppressed for months was finally, terribly released. The transformation was violent, primal and beautiful. And when it was finished, when the light faded and the smoke cleared, Newton Pius stood before her in his true form. A man at last, silver hair falling past his shoulders, amber eyes blazing with power and pain, and something that looked like reverence as he stared down at the human woman who had freed him. "Rose," he said, and his real voice, rough from disuse and thick with emotion, was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Then the tower door exploded inward and guards poured in with weapons drawn and silver nets at the ready. Newton moved with speed Rose didn't know was possible. One moment he stood before her, newly transformed and swaying slightly, silver hair catching the moonlight like spun metal. The next he was crouched between her and the guards pouring through the doorway, his body, still weak from months of imprisonment, nonetheless positioned to shield her completely. "Stand down," he commanded, and Rose felt the power in his voice resonate through her bones. This was the voice of a king, an alpha who had led thousands, and even the hardened guards of Iron Vale Keep hesitated for a fraction of a second. But only a fraction. "The beast has transformed. Silver nets now." The guard captain's shout broke the spell, and suddenly the chamber erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward with weapons drawn and nets glinting with the sickly sheen of enchanted silver. Newton's hand shot out, gripping Rose's wrist with surprising gentleness despite the urgency. "Rose, can you stand?" She tried, but her legs buckled. She'd given too much of herself to break the chains and her body was paying the price. Newton caught her before she fell, lifting her with one arm as though she weighed nothing. "The window," Rose gasped, her mind still working even as her body failed. "The eastern window. There's a ledge that leads to the outer wall. The guards don't know about it because it's not on any official plans. My grandmother showed me once when..." A silver net whistled through the air toward them. Newton twisted, taking the impact on his shoulder with a hiss of pain as the enchanted metal burned his newly exposed skin. But he didn't drop Rose. Instead he ran. They hit the eastern window at full speed, Newton's shoulder smashing through the ancient glass in an explosion of shards and moonlight. Rose felt the sickening sensation of falling, then Newton's feet found purchase on the narrow stone ledge she'd described. It was barely wide enough for one person, let alone a man carrying a woman, but Newton moved along it with the sure-footedness of a wolf navigating a mountain path. Behind them, guards shouted and crossbow bolts pinged off stone, missing them by inches in the darkness. "Where does this lead?" Newton's voice was strained. He was injured, exhausted, running on pure determination and alpha will. "The old watchtower on the eastern wall. It's been abandoned for years. There's a stairwell that..." Rose's words cut off as Newton leaped, carrying them across a gap that should have been impossible to clear. They landed hard on another ledge and she heard him grunt with pain. "Newton, you're hurt." "I've survived worse." His amber eyes met hers for just a moment, and Rose saw in them gratitude, determination, and something fiercer. "You saved me, Rose. Now let me save you." They reached the abandoned watchtower just as alarm bells began to ring across Iron Vale Keep. Newton kicked open the rotted door and descended the spiral stairs in great bounding leaps that made Rose's stomach lurch. At the bottom, they emerged into a forgotten courtyard choked with weeds and debris. "The eastern gate is closest," Rose said quickly, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. "But it'll be guarded. There's a drainage grate near the kitchens that leads to the sewers. The passages eventually connect to the river outside the walls. It's disgusting and dangerous, but better than capture." Newton's jaw set with grim determination. He adjusted his hold on Rose, cradling her more securely against his chest. "Hold on to me." Rose wrapped her arms around his neck as Newton broke into a run. Despite months of starvation and torture, despite the fresh burns from the silver net, despite having just undergone a transformation that should have left him barely conscious, the Alpha King moved with deadly grace through the shadows of Iron Vale Keep. Rose directed him through passages she'd learned during midnight medical emergencies, through storage areas and forgotten corridors, staying ahead of the searching guards by mere moments. They could hear the sounds of pursuit growing behind them, shouted orders, running feet, the baying of tracking hounds. "There," Rose pointed to a grate partially hidden behind old crates near the kitchen's outer wall. "That's the entrance." Newton set her down carefully, then wrenched the grate free with his bare hands, metal shrieking in protest. The smell that wafted up was overwhelming, waste and rot and darkness. Rose forced herself to move to the edge despite her body's protests. "I'll go first," Newton said. "I can catch you when you drop." He disappeared into the darkness, and Rose heard the splash of his landing in water she didn't want to think about. Then his voice drifted up, still strained but steady. "I'm here." I won't let you fall. Rose closed her eyes and dropped into the darkness, trusting completely in someone she'd known only weeks, someone who until tonight had been trapped in wolf form. Strong arms caught her and Newton's presence flooded through their bond. Reassurance, protection, gratitude. They moved through the sewers by feel and Rose's fragmentary memory of the layout, wading through water that soaked them to the bone. Behind them, faint sounds of pursuit echoed. The guards had found their escape route. How far to the river? Newton asked, his breathing labored now, his strength finally beginning to flag. Not far. Maybe another 100 yards. Newton, you need to rest. No time. He pushed forward, one hand on the slimy wall for guidance, the other keeping Rose steady. They'll seal the river exit if we don't reach it first. They stumbled through the darkness together, Rose leaning on Newton who was leaning on sheer determination. The bond between them pulsed with shared exhaustion and stubborn refusal to give up. Finally, Rose saw moonlight ahead, the river gate. They emerged from the sewers into the cold night air, and Rose had never been so grateful to feel wind on her face. The river rushed past them, swollen with spring melt, dangerous and dark. On the far bank she could see the forest, freedom if they could reach it. Can you swim? Newton asked. Yes, but you're injured and exhausted. The current is too strong. Rose. He turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders, his amber eyes intense in the moonlight. I've survived 8 months of torture. I've broken enchanted chains. I've escaped the most fortified keep in the north. I'm not going to let a river stop us now. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Besides, I'm a wolf. We're excellent swimmers. Behind them, shouts rang out. The guards had reached the sewer exit. Newton took Rose's hand, his grip firm and warm despite everything. Together. Rose looked into his eyes and saw her own determination reflected back at her. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to fail now. Together, she agreed. They jumped into the river just as crossbow bolts began to fly, the current catching them immediately and pulling them downstream, away from Ironvale Keep, away from the life Rose had known, toward an uncertain future in the wild lands beyond human control. As the cold water closed over her head, Rose felt Newton's hand tighten on hers, felt their bond flare with fierce determination. They surfaced together, gasping, already being swept toward the forest. The northern shore, Newton managed between strokes, his injured body struggling against the current. My people. If we can reach the Shadowpine border. A massive shape suddenly rose from the water ahead of them, and Rose's scream was cut off as something grabbed her, pulling her away from Newton with terrifying strength. The last thing she saw before going under was Newton's face, twisted with rage and fear as he fought against his own captor. A werewolf 3 times his size with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. They hadn't escaped into freedom. They'd been captured by something far worse than Ironvale Keep's guards. Rose woke to the smell of pine smoke and the sensation of warmth against her back. She sat up with a gasp, memories flooding back. The river, the attack, the massive werewolves with red eyes dragging them under. But instead of a dungeon or chains, she found herself in a small cave, wrapped in a cloak that wasn't hers, with a fire crackling nearby. Newton sat at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the dawn light filtering through the forest. He'd found clothes somewhere, rough traveler's garments that hung loose on his still gaunt frame. When he heard her move, he turned, and the relief in his amber eyes was palpable. You're safe, he said, his voice still rough but stronger than it had been. They were my people. A border patrol that's been searching for me. Rose's heart slowly stopped racing. Your people. Not enemies. Not enemies. Newton moved closer, lowering himself to sit beside her with the careful movements of someone whose body was still healing. They've been looking for me for 8 months. When they sensed alpha power in the river, my power finally released, they came immediately. A shadow crossed his face. Though they didn't expect to find me with a human. Are they angry? Rose asked quietly, suddenly aware of how precarious her position was. She had freed the Alpha King, yes, but she was still human in werewolf territory. They're confused. Suspicious. But alive because I ordered them to stand down. Newton's eyes met hers. Rose, we need to keep moving. Ironvale will send hunters, human trackers and possibly hired mercenaries. We have maybe a day's head start, no more. They traveled north for 3 days, moving through forests so ancient and wild that Rose felt like she'd stepped into another world entirely. Newton's patrol had provided supplies and then melted back into the wilderness to cover their trail, leaving just the two of them to navigate terrain that grew increasingly mountainous and treacherous. Rose watched in quiet amazement as Newton transformed day by day. The hollow-cheeked prisoner who could barely stand was becoming someone else. Someone powerful, commanding, dangerous in a way that should have frightened her but somehow didn't. He hunted for their food, found shelter with an ease that spoke of deep connection to the wild, and pushed them forward with the determination of someone racing against time. On the third night, camped in a grove where luminescent mushrooms cast eerie blue light, Rose finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the chains broke. What happened between us in that tower? When I touched the chains, when our energy connected, she struggled to find words for something that defied explanation. It felt like our souls were merging. Newton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something profound. It's called a soul bond. In my language, we call it fate threading. It's incredibly rare. Even among werewolves, most never experience it. He looked at her then, and Rose saw vulnerability in his eyes that the Alpha King probably showed to no one else. It's a connection between true mates. Two souls that recognize each other across any barrier, any circumstance. When it forms, it's permanent. Unbreakable. Rose's breath caught. Mates. You mean? I mean that somehow, impossibly, a human healer and a werewolf king have formed a bond that my people believe only happens once in 1,000 years. Newton's jaw tightened. It shouldn't be possible between species. Every law of nature says it can't happen. But Rose, what I feel through our connection. He pressed a hand to his chest. I feel your heartbeat as clearly as my own. I know when you're tired, frightened, in pain. And in that tower, when you offered your life force to break my chains, our souls didn't just touch. They braided together. Rose absorbed this, her mind reeling. Is that why I could hear your thoughts? Why I had those dreams? The bond was forming even then, probably from the first moment you showed me kindness when everyone else saw only a monster to be destroyed. Newton shifted closer, his expression intent. Rose, you need to understand what this means. A soul bond can't be severed. What's between us now? It's permanent. Something happens to me, you'll feel it. If something happens to you. His voice cracked slightly. I don't know that I'd survive it. And if I choose to leave? Rose asked quietly. To return to my own people? The bond doesn't care about choice or circumstance. It just is. Newton's eyes searched hers. But I would never force you to stay with me. You've already sacrificed everything, your home, your safety, your future, to save my life. I won't ask you to give up your humanity too. Rose thought about Ironvale Keep, about the life she'd left behind. The healer's quarters where she'd lived in her grandmother's shadow. The grateful patients and the demanding physicians. The comfortable certainty of knowing exactly who she was and what her place in the world would be. Then she thought about what she'd felt in that tower when their energies merged. A completeness she'd never known existed. A sense of belonging that had nothing to do with place and everything to do with soul. What happens when we reach your kingdom? She asked instead of answering. Newton's expression grew troubled. That depends on many things. On whether my throne still exists or if Victor Ashclaw has claimed it in my absence. On whether my pack will accept a human Luna Queen. He stopped abruptly. I'm sorry. I'm assuming things I have no right to assume. Luna Queen. Rose tested the words, finding them foreign and terrifying and somehow right all at once. Is that what the bond makes me? Your queen. The bond makes you my mate. My equal. My other half. Newton's voice was fierce now. What you become beyond that, it's your choice, Rose. Always your choice. Before Rose could respond, Newton's head jerked up, his body going tense. Through their bond she felt his sudden spike of alarm. What is it? Hunters, Newton said, already moving to douse the fire. Close. Too close. They must have tracked us faster than I anticipated. He turned to her and Rose saw the warrior king fully present now. Rose, listen carefully. We're 3 hours from the Shadowpine border. Once we cross it, we're under my kingdom's protection. But those 3 hours, they're going to be the most dangerous of your life. Rose stood, her heart hammering but her voice steady. Then we run. Newton's hand found hers in the darkness, and through their bond, Rose felt his fierce determination and deeper fear, not for himself but for her. "Stay close to me," he said. "No matter what happens, don't let go." They ran through the night forest with the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer behind them, and Rose realized with crystalline clarity that there was no going back now. Whatever waited ahead in the Shadowpine Kingdom, acceptance or rejection, coronation or exile, her fate was irrevocably tied to the silver-haired king whose hand held hers like a lifeline in the darkness. The bond pulsed between them with every heartbeat, and Rose knew Newton felt it too. They would reach his kingdom together or they would die together. There would be no other ending to this story they'd written in blood and sacrifice and impossible love. They crossed the Shadowpine border just as dawn broke over the mountains, and Rose felt the change immediately. The air itself seemed different here, charged with wild magic that made her skin tingle. The hunting party from Iron Vale never made it across. Newton's border patrols had been waiting, and the human hunters found themselves facing a wall of werewolves who had finally, after 8 months of searching, found their missing king. The message was clear. Newton Pius was home and he was under the protection of his entire kingdom. But the kingdom Newton returned to was not the one he'd left. They were met 3 miles inside the border by what remained of the royal guard, 30 warriors where once there had been hundreds. Their captain, a grizzled wolf named Marcus with a scar bisecting his face, dropped to one knee the moment he saw Newton, and tears ran unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. "Pi King," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "We thought you dead. Victor claimed you'd abandoned us, that you'd fled rather than face the responsibility of leadership. He's been consolidating power, eliminating anyone who questioned his authority. The kingdom is on the brink of civil war." Newton's jaw tightened, and through their bond, Rose felt his rage kindle like a forge fire. "Then we end this. Today." They traveled to the capital under heavy guard, and Rose became acutely aware of the stares that followed her. Werewolves lined the forest paths, emerging from shadows to catch a glimpse of their returned king, and the human woman who walked at his side. She heard the whispers, felt the weight of their suspicion and confusion. A human? With the Alpha King? Is she a prisoner? A hostage? Why does she bear his scent? Why does he protect her so fiercely? Newton kept her close, one hand always within reach, his presence through their bond a constant reassurance. But Rose could feel his tension mounting as they approached the capital. This was his home, his kingdom, and it had been nearly destroyed in his absence. The Shadowpine capital was breathtaking, a city built into the living trees of an ancient forest, with structures that seemed to grow organically from massive trunks and bridges of woven branches connecting different levels. But Rose could see the signs of turmoil: burned buildings, empty streets, the haunted expressions of the few citizens brave enough to venture out. They reached the throne hall as the sun reached its zenith. The great chamber was carved from the heart of the largest tree in the forest, its walls lined with the carved names of every alpha who had ruled for the past 1,000 years. And standing before the throne, a seat of polished wood and silver that should have been empty, was Victor Ashclaw. He was massive even for a werewolf, with black fur shot through with silver and eyes that held cold calculation. When he saw Newton enter, he smiled. Well, the lost king returns." Victor's voice dripped with false warmth. "We all assumed you were dead, Newton. Tragic really. But the kingdom couldn't wait forever. Someone had to take responsibility." "You mean someone had to seize power while I was conveniently imprisoned in Iron Vale Keep?" Newton's voice was deadly calm, but Rose felt the fury radiating through their bond. "Tell me, Victor, how much did Lord Brennan pay you to betray your Alpha King?" The throne hall went silent. Victor's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Careful with your accusations, Newton. You've been gone 8 months. Things have changed. The pack follows strength, and you..." His gaze raked over Newton's still gaunt frame. "You look like you can barely stand. Then let's test that theory." Newton stepped forward, and Rose felt power rolling off him in waves. Alpha dominance that made every werewolf in the hall instinctively lower their eyes. "I challenge you, Victor Ashclaw, for the throne of the Shadowpine Kingdom. Trial by combat as is our law. Unless you're too much of a coward to face me." Victor's smile turned to a snarl. "You'll die for that insult. Then I'll die a king." Newton turned to Rose, and his expression softened for just a moment. Through their bond, he sent her a wave of love and fierce protectiveness. "Rose, whatever happens, Win, she said simply. Come back to me. The combat was brutal and swift. Victor was larger, fresher, but Newton fought with the desperation of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. Rose watched, her heart in her throat, as the two wolves tore into each other with savage efficiency. Blood stained the throne hall floor. The sound of snarling and snapping filled the ancient chamber. Then Newton found an opening. He moved with speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone so recently recovered, his jaws closing around Victor's throat in the killing position. The traitor went still, knowing that one wrong move would end his life. Yield, Newton growled, the word distorted by his wolf form but unmistakable. Or die. Victor yielded. When Newton released him, he transformed back to human form, standing before his kingdom bloodied but victorious. Victor Ashclaw, you are guilty of treason, conspiracy, and attempted usurpation. I strip you of your rank, your title, and your place in this pack. You are exiled, effective immediately. If you return, the sentence is death. Guards dragged the former conspirator away, and Newton turned to face his people. I know you've suffered in my absence. I know trust has been broken and blood has been spilled. But I'm here now, and I swear to you, on my life, on my throne, on everything I am, that I will rebuild what was destroyed. We will heal. We will be strong again. The throne hall erupted in howls of support and relief. But Rose saw the exhaustion in Newton's eyes, felt through their bond how close he was to collapse. The days that followed were a blur of reconstruction and reconciliation. Newton worked tirelessly to repair the damage Victor had done, to reunite fractured packs, to restore order to a kingdom that had nearly torn itself apart. And through it all, Rose stood beside him, using her healing skills to tend to the wounded, her compassion to bridge gaps that politics alone couldn't cross. But the question remained unspoken between them. What was Rose's place in this kingdom? It came to a head 2 weeks after their arrival, during a council meeting where Newton's advisors debated the kingdom's future. One of them, an elderly female named Elena with wise gray eyes, finally addressed the issue everyone had been avoiding. My king, the human woman who travels with you, the one who bears your scent, your protection, your obvious favor. Elena's gaze was shrewd but not unkind. The pack needs to understand her position. Is she a guest? An ally? Or something more? Newton's hand found Rose's under the council table, his fingers intertwining with hers. She's my mate. My true mate, bound to me by a soul bond that formed during my imprisonment. The council chamber exploded with shocked murmurs. Elena's eyes widened. A soul bond? Between species? My king, such a thing is supposed to be impossible, I know. Newton's voice was firm. But it exists nonetheless. Rose Sylvester risked everything to save my life when no one else would. She broke enchanted chains with nothing but her will and her compassion. She fled into exile rather than abandon me to death. The bond between us is real, permanent, and not subject to debate. But a human Luna Queen? Another advisor protested. The pack will never accept. Then the pack will learn. Newton stood, his alpha dominance filling the chamber. Or they will leave. Because Rose stays. That is not negotiable. Later, alone in the chambers Newton had been given in the palace tree, Rose finally confronted what she'd been avoiding for days. Their right to question it, she said quietly, standing by the window that overlooked the forest kingdom. I'm human, Newton. I don't understand your laws, your customs, your way of life. How can I be a queen to a people I know nothing about? Newton moved behind her, his arms encircling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. You can learn. You have been learning. I've watched you with the pack, seen how you earn their trust one person at a time with your healing and your kindness. But is that enough? Rose leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steady pulse of their bond. What if choosing me tears your kingdom apart again? Rose. Newton turned her gently to face him, his amber eyes intense. You saved my life. You freed me from chains that were meant to hold me until death. You gave up everything, your home, your safety, your entire world, for someone you barely knew. If that doesn't qualify you to stand beside me, then nothing does. I didn't do it to become a queen, Rose whispered. I did it because it was right. Because you were suffering and I couldn't look away. I know. Newton's hand cupped her face with infinite tenderness. That's exactly why you should be queen. Not because of what you want for yourself, but because of what you want for others. That's what leadership truly is. Rose closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the choice before her. She could return to Ironvale Keep. Lord Brennan had been arrested by his own council once the truth of Newton's imprisonment came out, and messengers had brought word that she would be welcomed home. She could return to her old life, to the familiar world of herbs and healing, to the comfortable certainty of being fully human. Or she could step into the unknown. She could become something unprecedented, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for centuries, a symbol of what compassion could achieve when fear was set aside. Through their bond she felt Newton's love, his hope, his willingness to let her go if that was what she needed. And that, his willingness to suffer through their separation if it meant her happiness, made her decision crystallize with perfect clarity. "I choose you," Rose said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I choose us. I choose to be the bridge, even if it's terrifying, even if I fail sometimes. Because what we have, this bond, this love, it's worth fighting for. It's worth building a future around." The relief and joy that flooded through their connection nearly drove them both to their knees. The coronation was held under the full moon, in a clearing so ancient that the trees surrounding it had witnessed the crowning of every Shadowpine ruler for a millennium. Rose wore a gown of silver and blue that Newton's people had crafted for her, woven with threads that seemed to capture moonlight itself. Her chestnut hair was adorned with flowers native to the Shadowpine forests, a symbol of her adoption into this wild kingdom. Newton stood beside her in formal robes, his silver hair unbound, his amber eyes bright with emotion. The entire pack had gathered, thousands of werewolves who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom to witness this unprecedented ceremony. Elena, as the kingdom's eldest and most respected advisor, performed the ritual. She placed a circlet of silver and moonstone on Rose's head, lighter than a crown but no less significant. "Rose Sylvester," Elena's voice carried across the silent crowd. "You stand before the Shadowpine pack not as one born to us, but as one chosen by fate itself. You broke the chains that bound our king. You sacrificed your world to save his life. You offer yourself now as a bridge between species that have known only war and distrust. Do you accept the responsibility of Luna Queen? Will you stand with our Alpha King, guide our people, and lead us toward a future where compassion matters more than the boundaries between us?" Rose's voice was steady when she answered, carrying clearly in the moonlit silence. "I accept." A howl rose from the crowd. One voice, then 10, then hundreds, until the entire forest seemed to sing with the sound of a kingdom welcoming its new queen. Rose felt tears streaming down her face as the reality of what she'd become crashed over her. She was no longer just a healer from Ironvale Keep. She was Rose Sylvester, Luna Queen of the Shadowpine Kingdom, a human woman who had done the impossible by refusing to accept that some chains couldn't be broken, some bonds couldn't exist, some futures couldn't be built. Newton took her hand, raising it high, and his voice rang out with authority and fierce pride. "Behold your Luna Queen. Let her name be written in the histories alongside mine. Let her reign mark the beginning of a new era, one where the boundaries between our kinds begin to dissolve, where peace is built not on fear and separation, but on understanding and unity." The howling intensified, and Rose saw in the faces around her not just acceptance but hope. Hope that the future could be different than the past. Hope that one human woman's compassion could indeed transform an entire kingdom. Later, alone with Newton in their chambers, Rose stood at the window watching moonlight filter through the ancient trees. She could feel the weight of the circlet on her head, the enormity of what she'd agreed to become. "Any regrets?" Newton asked softly, coming to stand beside her. Rose thought about everything she'd lost. Her old life, her certainty, her comfortable invisibility. Then she thought about everything she'd gained, a love that transcended species, a purpose that mattered beyond herself, a kingdom full of people who were learning to see her not as an outsider, but as one of their own. "Not a single one," she said, and meant it completely. Through their bond, she felt Newton's answering surge of love and gratitude and fierce protective devotion. They stood together in the moonlight, Alpha King and Luna Queen, werewolf and human, two souls who had found each other across impossible barriers and chosen to build something new from the ruins of old prejudices. Rose Sylvester had entered a dark tower to feed a chained wolf, and in doing so she'd freed a king, transformed herself, and planted the seeds of peace between two worlds that had forgotten how to trust. The chains were broken. The king had risen. And a healer had become a queen not through conquest or birthright, but through the simple radical act of refusing to look away from suffering, even when everyone else already had. In the end, that was the only magic that truly mattered. And there you have it, a healer who became a queen by refusing to look away from suffering. If you loved Rose and Newton's journey, smash that subscribe button because my next video is going to blow your mind. We're diving into a story of forbidden magic, deadly secrets, and a heroine who must choose between saving her kingdom or saving her soul. Don't miss it. Subscribe now and I'll see you in the next story.